Reinier de Graaf se sumó a OMA en 1996, responsable de la construcción y el diseño del plan maestro de diversos proyectos en Europa, Rusia y Medio Oriente. Ha supervisado la creciente integración de AMO en temas de planeación energética y sustentabilidad. Ha estado trabajando principalmente en Moscú, supervisando la propuesta de OMA para el diseño de un plan maestro y liderando un consorcio que propone un concepto de desarrollo para el Moscow Agglomeration. Reinier de Graaf es presentado por el Infonavit. Démosle la bienvenida a MEXTRÓPOLI 2017.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I don't speak a word of Spanish, but thank you for the nice words. Anyway, I'm very happy to have been invited by what I think is an incredibly impressive conference. I have named my talk The Century That Never Happened, and this is perhaps a funny title, but I hope that once I've finished, the title is clear and that possibly maybe even people will agree with me. For the past 30 years, we have been living under the reign of the market economy. Summarized in this diagram, a mirrored map of the world with the major currencies of the time, the yen, the euro, and the dollar, together spelling the word yes as a sign of the world's embrace of this system. All of this started with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of opposing blocs in the world, and of course this period that followed after the wall has been theorized best, but probably by Francis Fukuyama in his book The End of History. Fukuyama presumed that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Western liberal democracy would become the only remaining form of human government. What had characterized the world until 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union, had been a situation of opposing blocs, Western liberal democracy, communism, and a large non-aligned bloc. And according to his thesis, it would only be a matter of time before all of the world would embrace democracy as a principle. What I think is inherently problematic is that the fall of the wall has always been claimed as a uniquely Western victory. This is Ronald Reagan, 2 years before the wall fell, in front of the wall with a speech where he called on Mr. Gorbachev to tear down the wall. That is a very monomanic version of history. This is the way they saw it at the other side. They viewed the wall as a 25 years means of protection against fascism. So as I said, the West has claimed the fall of the wall. The West has claimed this victory, and with that, a significant part, or at least half of the story, has been conveniently forgotten. And in the end, it wasn't the West that tore down the wall, it was the East that decided to tear down the wall. I'm telling this because I often think that the history of architecture as we know it is the result of similar misconceptions, of a half story which we take to be the whole story. This is a very famous picture. July 15, 1972, the demolition of the Pruitt-Igoe estate in St. Louis. The demolition of a very large social housing estate, which was heralded by the critics, amongst others Charles Jenks, as the end or the bankruptcy of modern architecture. Not only is it the bankruptcy of modern architecture, it is also the bankruptcy of all modernism claims on the city, and any kind of social pretension of modern architecture is herewith unbelievable. With that, this is the Pruitt-Igoe estate in St. Louis. With the abolition of Pruitt-Igoe, in a way, in one stroke, all of modernism disappeared. You said no to this. We said no to the theories of the Bauhaus and Hilbersheimer. After the war, the utopias of the metabolists have now been discredited. Louis Kahn, large-scale project, Philadelphia, discredited. The revisionist movement of Team 10 also discredited. Their successor, Jaap Bakema, a very famous architect from the Netherlands, also discredited. And even the more dystopian internal criticism of modernism, here in the form of Per Studio, has also been discredited. The writing about a single housing estate, about the single failure of a housing estate, has essentially wiped out nearly a century of architectural experiments. Now, what if the assumptions about Pruitt-Igoe and whatever has been said about Pruitt-Igoe is wrong? What if it's a myth? What if that story is based on falsehoods, like a sort of early form of fake news? There was a documentary recently called The Pruitt-Igoe Myth, and I'd like to tag along with that. Essentially, in a way, reconstruct the housing estate and see what really happened. Interestingly, this is the presentation of the housing estate to the authorities, early 1950s. The guy standing here is Minoru Yamasaki. That's the architect of the estate. He is better. This is his better known work, which is also no longer there. He's suffered a very unfortunate fate as an architect, even though he wasn't a bad architect. Anyway, a typical modern housing estate with multi-story blocks, in a way facilitating large open public spaces between them, and even a very popular estate at the time of its constructions, an estate that was aggressively advertised as a new form of living, an estate that would clear the slums of the inner city of St. Louis. It even won awards. It was very favoritively written about by the architectural press. And as I said, an interesting form of slum clearance. Pruitt-Igoe, the name is derived from the names of two men. Wendell Pruitt, a black American decorated serviceman, and William Igoe, a renowned white congressman. At the time of the design in 1954, racial segregation was still there in the United States. The Brown versus the Board of Education is 1956. So at the time of the conception, the area had two parts. The blacks would live in Pruitt, whites would live in Igoe, but as a whole, in a way, the estate would cater to both. Here you see the day of its inauguration in 1956, and by that time, actually interestingly, racial segregation had been abolished. So this would be the first racially integrated neighborhood of the United States. People were very happy about that. This is Miss Ruby Russell. It's a beautiful place, like a big hotel resort, I'd say, with plenty of green grass, trees, shrubberies, and all the works. This is the reaction of the whites. Well, I just couldn't live besides them. One of the main reasons I moved here, that's the suburbs, was because it was a white community, and that is the only place I intend to live. At the time of Pruitt-Igoe, and at the time of the lifting of racial segregation, America embarked on a major suburbanization effort of its city. And it's my theory that part of that suburbanization effort has been a means to reinstate racial segregation, not by law, but by territory. If they had to live together, whites would just flee the city and live in the suburbs. Here you go. Suburban homes, also made possible by the Federal Housing Act, realized on a massive scale all across America. The lifestyle led in these suburban homes idealized to a great degree, even to the extent that American TV series in the 50s and the 60s, in a way, were a kind of covert celebration of the happy lives and somewhat of a gender stagnation, I guess, of the time. And of course, that meant that the inner city of St. Louis, within a decade, dropped from 850,000 to about 300,000. That meant that the people who were left there were largely poor. They're the ones that couldn't afford to move in the suburbs. At the same time, policies against public housing were increasingly less favorable. Measures were taken that the decay of the thing, which of course was as a result of the abandonment. The cost of maintenance had to be paid by residents themselves, which of course was unbearable financial burden for whoever was left. The Pruitt-Igoe estate made national television. Its dire conditions made national televisions until it became a complete kind of anti-hype. And of course, as a result, finally, in 1972, just 16 years after it was built, the house was torn down. End of story. But is it? Because this is where it was. This is where it was. This is where Pruitt-Igoe was. This is where Pruitt-Igoe was, nearly completely empty. The church, of course, is the only sign of civilization and human presence, since this is America. And what was essentially, interestingly, a big urban settlement became a park. But not only did Pruitt-Igoe disappear, by and large, the whole neighborhood around it sort of disappeared in it, so that there is this large urban wasteland left. The destruction of Pruitt-Igoe, the demolition of IRA, clearly didn't solve the housing crisis. Missouri, and St. Louis in particular, is still one of the areas with the largest homelessness in the United States, a homelessness that is probably much bigger than statistics show, a kind of hidden homelessness. And in that sense, you wonder, the large-scale demolition of social housing estates coupled to a vast problem of homelessness, whether any of this made any sense. The United States, the whole economy, meanwhile, an enormous victim of inequality. Inequality that is now officially named as the source of economic trouble. I would like to make a comparison. I would like to make an economic comparison which somehow offers an interesting explanation for this whole course of history. That is the book of Thomas Piketty, a French economist that largely wrote the book in the United States. And he has theorized, in a way, this particular period in which Pruitt-Igoe was built. He has a very simple economic analysis. He compares the return on labor by the return on capital. In other words, how much money do you make from working? How much money do you make from simply having money? The moment you make more money from having money than you do from working, somebody who works can work all he wants, but he'll never catch up. And this is what is happening. He's tracked the two over the course of history. And in it found that essentially the post-war period is the only time that actually you could make more money from working than you could make more money than from having money. And this is very interesting because this is the period where essentially the curve of labor surpasses the curves of capital. That is the period. These are the major utopias which were invalidated by the demolition of Pruitt-Igoe. If you put them in this timeline, they sort of neatly comply to the extent that you could interpret them as efforts to translate social mobility into concrete in most cases. Pruitt-Igoe, of course, sent shockwaves across the confidence of architects. After that, largely the manifestos that architects wrote became pensive, and in a way, but still completed the whole thing to the point that this particular period in history, from 1940 to 1989, is actually the utopian period of modern thinking. That period ran from the outbreak of World War I to the fall of the Berlin Wall. To the most important manifesto, architectural manifesto, artistic manifesto of 1914 is the Futurist Manifesto by Marinetti, published in the Figaro. The most important manifesto of 1989, when the wall fell, is A Vision of Britain by Prince Charles. And that, in a way, accounts for a curious course of history where what was started with the bloody uniform of the assassinated emperor of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, Franz Ferdinand, somehow ends up with the decorated uniform of the Prince of Wales, where you see two men, 1914, 1989, with a seamless, uninterrupted course of history, could almost be a single vision, and a particular vision of architecture, which is also remarkably consensual. And if you take this into account, you could say that this whole period of Piketty actually never happened, that this is the course of history. And if that sounds a radical proposition, look what happened after Pruitt-Igoe. Pruitt-Igoe, 1972. Minguet, Lyon, 1994, another social housing estate. Norfolk and Sheffield. Robert Taylor Homes, Chicago. Dublin, Naples, Paris, Lyon again, Nantes, Belfast, Glasgow, Lyon. This can go on for more than 45 minutes, I can. Paris once again, Glasgow once again, the tower in Frankfurt. And inasmuch as these social housing towers do not get demolished, they get sold on the market. This is a one-bedroom unit of Trellick Tower in London. One-bedroom unit. That actually goes for a sum of money which is completely unaffordable to anybody with a moderate income. So social housing estates, they either get demolished or they become so desirable that they become unaffordable. And that doesn't add up. That apparently they either go or they're there for the super rich. So I guess that settles utopia. We know what we had before, but what will we have after? Modern architecture, of course, stylistically, is by no means finished. You know, we had constructivism. We still have constructivism. Golosov in Moscow, don't know who this is, in Cincinnati. The Wolkenbügel by Lisitsky, the Wolkenbügel in Rotterdam. The Unité d'Habitation in Marseille. The Unité d'Habitation in Connecticut. Eisenman in Utrecht and Rietveld in Connecticut. And interestingly, and I said nothing is personal, Barcelona Pavilion with its beautiful onyx wall and our own tribute to it, a bus stop in Groningen with a significantly reduced onyx wall, entirely for budget reasons. Modern architecture and modern architecture's most important manifesto is still there. It still gets built. But you find it on the real estate websites of countries like Greece, where you get a significant tax break if you don't finish your building. So modern architecture is meant to be an incompleted project, because only when it's an incompleted project is it actually financially feasible. Strange. I guess modern architecture survived on the condition that it in a way abandoned its ideological claims. We no longer want this. But there are others who now talk about the city who are similarly megalomaniacal. This is the smart city, no longer made by architects, largely made by tech companies. The smart city is the universal fascination of tech companies, as you can see here, Siemens, etc., etc. And it is now no longer architects who write manifestos. It is actually these companies that write manifestos, where they claim to be able to solve from anything from poverty, climate change, dwindling resources, etc., etc., etc. Look at a number of them. Siemens, Cisco, IBM, the largest protagonists of the smart city. This is, I don't know who this is, I believe it's Cisco. They pose as kind of ersatz urbanists. They offer social services, education, public safety. Here we have Cisco offering, again, public services, water, mobility. And here we have Siemens offering public administration, security, energy provision, water provision, healthcare. And the interesting thing is that these are private companies. And all of what they offer used to be public tasks, but no longer. Their implicit message is that with all they can collectively deliver, the public sector has become redundant. And look, in that sense, what globalization brought us. These are three categories, ranked in terms of size. These are countries, these are cities, these are businesses. Normally, we're inclined to think that countries are bigger than cities, cities are bigger than corporations. But such is no longer the case. This is the list once you eliminate all categories and you simply rank these three things according to size. You see that Walmart is bigger than Norway. You see that the economy of BP is larger than the economy of Greece, and this was before the Greek crisis. Essentially, that creates an interesting situation of a new David and Goliath, where, of course, inevitably, the bigger corporations grow, the less they're likely to be loyal at their place of origin. A bit of proof. Amazon. You can see this all over the news. Amazon faces European Union tax dodge avoidance investigation. British want to stop Starbucks from dodging taxes. It won't work. And this one is priceless. Google chairman Eric Schmidt defends Google tax dodge. It's called capitalism. Plain and simple. This is an interesting thing because this is ultimately, of course, the outcome of Fukuyama. That before a globalized world, you could presume a certain degree of loyalty of business to nations. After 1991, corporations are largely footloose. They operate on a global stage. The world has no governance. They are therefore free. That's what freedom means. And the nation is sort of left as an odd one out, as a weird situation of multiple choice, where kind of a la carte, you can pick your place of your head office, but you can also, in a way, in a very postmodern way, pick your loyalties and shift your loyalties should life become too difficult. I think it is interesting that therefore you could say that Fukuyama's prediction in part came through, but in quite a different way than he had imagined. His prediction originates from the fall of the Berlin Wall. Meanwhile, you are probably all too familiar with it. Other walls are in the making. Not just here, not just between the US and America, but actually we are facing a global situation where there is an increasing resistance against the idea of globalization, and nobody wants to have anything to do with anybody else. We thought we were going to have a global democracy in the early 90s. We have something very different. We have, again, three blocks. And let me explain this briefly. This is blue. It's the electoral democracy. It's a system we know. It's a system we thought would be everywhere. In an electoral democracy, you have elections. Red is a non-democracy. There you don't have elections. But the most interesting category here is the yellow. It is countries where you have elections, but you know the outcome in advance. Remarkable beacons of stability, predictability, a condition very, very much favored by business. The nasty thing is that for a long time, the West told the world, if you become a liberal democracy, you become rich. You're from a poor country, you will transform into a rich country. But the weird irony is if you add up capital available at nations, Norway is the only democracy in the top 5. Well, I mean, if you add them all up, it is actually non-democracy that has most capital at their disposal. It is non-democracies where the fastest urban growth in history ever is now happening. This is Dubai in the early 90s, at the time of Fukuyama's book. This is Sheikh Zayed Road. This is a public housing facility. This is that same road 25 years later. This is Sheikh Zayed Road. He had dwindled in the corners, the same public housing estate, and you have an eruption of, I guess you could call it modernity, at a speed and at a scale unprecedented. There is a thriving global metropolis here, and probably nothing in this picture is older than 10 years. Dubai is an interesting case. It produces maps like a form of fake news. More than half of it is in the sea. But this is there, that isn't. That isn't, that is there, that used to be there, but it's kind of sinking into the sea, and that, again, isn't. But this map is put out so often, so frequently. This map decorates every single government office, every single major development corporation, so frequently and so often, that to the innocent bystander, this actually is Dubai. A collection of theme parks, of rapid developments. Also, interestingly, huge development with barely a local population, where all these developments, in a way, compete. Private developments kind of compete with each other to attract attention, and by attracting attention, attracting future populations. The city used to be something you built for people that were there but didn't have a home. Currently, the city is something for people that are not yet there, but that you are hoping to attract by building. So there's a weird inversion of the chronology, of which Dubai is a very extreme part. Now, when we look at this, we in a way see a landscape of healthy private real estate competition. At least that is what we think, because all of these developers are owned in 51% by only 3 major corporations, which in turn are owned in 51% by one man, which means that we are actually looking at a monopoly disguised as a competitive free market economy. And this is a very successful game on a global stage. They have government, they have institutional structure, pretty much like anywhere else. But the way this structure is populated is very interesting. Normally, if you take public office, you leave your businesses. You have to abolish private interests to avoid a conflict of interest. Here, this is the public sector, this is the private sector. And it is not because of local dress that people look the same, they look the same because they are the same. Their system, essentially, the head of the Executive Council is also a property developer head, the Department of Economic Development is a property developer, Jebel Aliport is a property developer. I think this Donald Trump took a few clues from these guys, but it's a carefully engineered conflict of interest, deliberate conflict of interest as a business model, where you're not sure. You know, we had countries, we had cities, we had businesses. When you look at Dubai, you're not sure what you're looking at. Are you looking at a country? Are you looking at a city? Or are you looking at a business? Or are you looking at something that is all of the three at once and can pretend to be whatever at any convenient opportunity? They are successful. Dubai property developers export their stuff all over the world. Where it used to be Western architectural practices that exported their knowledge to wherever, it is now these people. All the way from Morocco to the Philippines, confidently predicting that one day all cities will be like this. And what is interesting, in my view, is the response that our own profession is giving to this situation. Look at this. Hugh Perman, an architecture critic, quoting, I believe, Rogers or Foster, it doesn't matter, China rather than England. In Beijing, they've built a much larger new terminal than T5, design of plus a new runway to serve it in less than 5 years, I gather. In a way, weirdly admiring the efficiency of authoritarian systems. They do things faster, they don't talk about them at long, etc., etc. These are a number of quotes. Foster. We're in a state of denial, while they, the Chinese, are making decisions in the spirits of the Victorians. They have the courage to try it. What attracts me about China is that there is still a state. There is something that can take initiative on a scale and of a nature that almost nobody that we know of today could ever afford or contemplate. No idea who this is. The more centralized the power, the less compromises need to be made. In architecture, the directions are clearer. Eisenman. Democracy is obviously not something we want to get rid of, but it does create chaos. This is Frank Gehry. I don't know what to make of this. People can build whatever they want. And here, some of the most amazing places were built because of dictators. Architecture is always related to powers and related to large interests, whether financial or political, to me. And I think this one is priceless. This is the ideal client of the architect, a benevolent dictator with taste. So where does that leave us? I mean, where does that leave us as a profession? Because you could say, if I listen to all of this, if it were up to these guys, you know, this system would not be blue, it would be entirely yellow. It'd be entirely a predictable situation which largely takes democratic principles for a ride. It would mean that Fukuyama's prediction comes through with the exception that it's not a Western liberal democracy that comes through. It is something different, and we are slowly but surely witnessing the first signs. This used to be a dictatorship that we condemned, very critical. When we built in China, the whole world was very critical of us. Nevertheless, the country that was most critical, meanwhile, if the iconography is anything to go by, isn't a whole hell of a lot better. I would like to end on Germany, because that's the country where I started with the Berlin Wall, and I would like to take a look at what happened to Germany over the last 25 years, because it is a country that is still in pretty good state, so it would be fair to probably measure history by the course of the German history over 25 years. I would like to look at a particular place, at a particular village near Berlin, Marzahn. This was the city where the Soviet troops arrived in 1945 to start the final siege of Berlin. About 12 kilometers outside the central part of Berlin. This was also in 1972. That's the same year that Pruitt-Igoe got demolished, remember? Embarked on a major effort. In 1972, this village looked like it was still the 18th century, an essentially rural, calm community which history had passed by. Then overnight, a city of 250,000 people was built within its borders. And here you see I have a horse and carriage, 18th century, but here the 20th century arrives very aggressively. This is the largest social housing project ever built anywhere. That provided a lot of people a home. And it is a very interesting thing about this, because if you look at it in color, interestingly, this last picture isn't Marzahn. Marzahn was East Germany. This is Gropiusstadt, which was in Berlin, which was West Germany. And it's very strange that, in a way, by shifting to the original color image is the only way to see the difference, is that before the wall fell, actually the physical substance in terms of housing was remarkably similar. This is West Berlin, this is East Berlin. I sometimes do a test if you take out West and East, and nobody's able to pick out the difference, even in Germany itself, which is very interesting. But then the wall fell, and then something started to happen, that this apparent similarity, this apparent simultaneous development, which included social housing on either side of the wall, started to disappear. Currently, the differences are somehow bigger than they were before the wall fell. East Germany, demographics. So here people go away, they all go here. Income, low. And this is in terms of purchasing power, because of course, in an absolute sense, people in communist countries always earned a lot less than in capitalist countries, but this is purchasing power, which now is larger. There's a larger difference than there used to be before 1989. And this is clearly unemployment, inversely proportional, huge unemployment in the East, no unemployment, or little unemployment in the West. Marzahn, if it once was the operation of the largest growth in history before 1989, it currently has an enormous exodus. This is how many people are leaving per year and the percentage of shrinkage. It firmly heads the list. That means it has an aging population, it has a population that leaves. There is schools, there's no more need for schools, schools are being demolished. And also the prefabricated housing estates that were built there very quickly are being demolished. Now all of this is sort of Soviet-style, communist-style prefabricated housing, assembled from panels, what they call the Platte in German. The advantage, one of the main advantages of prefabrication is of course that you build very fast by assembling the elements, but if you revert, you can also demolish it very fast, and you end up with the same spare parts that you essentially started with. And the interesting thing is that in Germany itself, currently, there's an enormous recycling economy that actually takes the demolished panels, reappropriates them, and actually applies them in a new architecture. An architecture that looks like this. And for me, this is a very interesting outcome of the architectural evolution of the 20th century. This house is built from recycled panels of a communist housing estate. Those traces are erased by a thick layer of stucco, by thick insulation, by PVC windows, and a pitched roof. But of course, this house essentially encapsulates all of the 20th century. It contains the Russian Revolution, it contains communism, it contains Khrushchev, it contains the export of Khrushchev ideas to East Germany after the war, it contains the fall of the wall, it contains the demolition of the housing estates, and somehow, magically, all of that ended up in this house, which is a house, you know, if you apply a sepia tone to it, this could be a picture from 1900. So hence, my thesis that I would like to leave you with, that the 20th century did not happen. Thank you very much. That was it.